don't necessarily wait until you're fully retired to take the family on that big trip. If you're, 60 and you're feeling good and your spouse is feeling good and you have the funds, take the big trip today while you're still working. And you might actually feel a little more comfortable with spending that money while you still have income coming in the door.
Welcome to Redefine Retirement with Ryan Wheless, powered by Allied Wealth. This podcast explores how to live a limitless life of abundance in retirement with clarity, purpose, and confidence. Welcome to Redefine Retirement with Ryan Wheless. Today's guest is Christine Benz, Morningstar's Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning. She's also the author of How to Retire, 20 Lessons for a Happy, Successful Retirement. Christine takes a holistic approach to retirement planning, covering everything from finances to relationships and well-being. Please welcome Christine Benz to the podcast. So, Christine, I welcome to Redefine Retirement. It's so awesome to have you here. I've been a huge fan and follower of your work for many, many years. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So let's start with the book. This book's all over the place. It's the talk of the town, so to speak. One of the big things in your book and in so many interviews is that retirement is not just a math problem. I really love that line, by the way. And it's interesting because at Allied Wealth, we talk about how you do have to solve an equation, and that is, how do you live the next 30, 40, and maybe even 50 years now in retirement and not run out of money or income in the process? But it doesn't start with that, does it? There's so much more to it.
Absolutely. And I understand why people gravitate to the numbers. They can be weighed and measured, and you can feel like you have some sense of certainty about what life will be like in retirement. But I think the financial piece is just kind of table stakes in this whole problem, that yes, you need to solve that as you do with your clients, but you also need to think about what you will do with this newfound time that you'll have when you separate from work, or if you pull back from work a little bit. And I think that's the part that people underrate in their retirement planning. And it may just be a function of the way we work in this country, that we work very intensely. People show up in retirement kind of exhausted, frankly, where they haven't really been able to visualize retirement beyond, maybe just the walking on the beach in the white shirt that they've seen in the ads, or, they're thinking about travel and spending time with grandkids. Those are all great things. You should do those things. You should relax, but you also still need to find things that give you a sense of purpose, that put you in contact with other human beings, that give you a sense of really mattering on this earth. And I think that's the piece that unfortunately many of us kind of short shrift as we lead up to retirement.
Yeah, I agree, Christine. Many times we ask people, like, why is it that you're wanting to retire now? Is it because you're 59.5 and you can access your retirement accounts without 10% early withdrawal penalty? Is it because you're 62 and you can take Social Security, or 65 and you hit Medicare age, or 67 in your FRA for Social Security? And if any of those answers are kind of like the reasons why, we strongly suggest that you don't, right? Don't retire until you have a vision. Where are you? Who are you with? And what are you doing, right? And it's a strong point that you make too. And I really resonate strongly with it, because if you can't answer those questions and you don't have a vision, what likely is going to happen is you're going to go home and sit in a lazy boy rocking chair. And the fastest way to poor health is doing exactly that.
Well, totally. And, I think we all have good and bad reference points for successful retirement. I remember when I was working on this book, I would tell people, well, each chapter's a lesson with someone. And invariably someone would say, oh, you have to meet so-and-so. You have to meet this person who has navigated retirement so beautifully, who has made a big impact, who has continued to stay connected in their communities. So that's one thing I would urge your listeners to do, to kind of mentally take stock of the retirees they've had experience with. And there are probably some good and bad examples in there, right? You've probably got the person who retreated to their chair and maybe came up with a really bad illness and then got sick, series of illnesses, and passed away within 5 years. That's obviously not what you're going for, but you kind of summon forth the positive mental reference points of retirement. If these people are around, ask them what they did to make their retirements a success. Start doing some fact finding. And another point I would make, Ryan, on this front is that I think one reason why people don't really visualize what their retirement might look like is what Jordan Grummett in the book calls purpose anxiety, that we are all sort of inculcated in this idea that, okay, you've got to have a purpose. And sometimes people are overwhelmed by that because they think it has to be this really grandiose thing that they have to accomplish. They think they need to start a foundation or, start climbing peaks or whatever. And maybe you do those things. But his point is, I think, rather reassuring, which is that you can have some what he calls smaller P purposes, things like gardening or bird watching or reconnecting with a childhood hobby. Those things are equally valid as animating forces in your retirement as the more grandiose big P purposes. So don't get overwhelmed by thinking that you need to do something really grandiose. Just have some fun, experiment with some activities, and, do a little bit of a mental audit about the types of activities that have brought you joy in the past. And those are good things to reconnect with.
I totally agree, Christine. And here's the other aspect of it. And I've struggled with this. It's not struggling with this. I'm actually doing more of this because of what I do as a financial advisor and financial planner. I get to the point sometimes where I see people over saving for retirement, right? They're in their early 50s, late 50s, somewhere in that range, not quite ready to get to retirement yet, but they're still just socking money away like crazy. And if you look at their numbers, we use a lot of Monte Carlo simulations and do some other stuff with guaranteed income, which is important, I believe. They've got the game won, yet they're not living in the present moment the way they could be living, like doing some traveling, right? And enjoying life along the way. So I do think there's a balancing act between folks that are, being over prepared for retirement and not enjoying their 50s at the rate they could be versus people that are underprepared for retirement. What's your take on that?
Absolutely. In fact, Ryan, one thing we've been calling internally at Morningstar is kind of the permission to spend problem that, and it's a little bit odd to talk about because we do have a lot of people in our society who are quite undersaved relative to what they'll need for retirement. But you also have people who are arguably overprepared and they've kind of burnished their identities as saving people. They're used to deferring gratification. They're used to living within their means. And it's become a little bit of a religion for them that they, really think of themselves as saving and investing people. And we all naturally tend to kind of anchor on whatever the high water mark was for our portfolio. It doesn't feel good to see our portfolios start to drop below whatever that highest level was. And so I get it, but it is a problem with some more affluent adults who have more than enough for retirement. They have trouble giving themselves permission to spend. And so one piece of advice that Jamie Hopkins gives in the book is get warmed up. In the years leading up to retirement, don't necessarily wait until you're fully retired to take the family on that big trip. If you're, 60 and you're feeling good and your spouse is feeling good and you have the funds, take the big trip today while you're still working. And you might actually feel a little more comfortable with spending that money while you still have income coming in the door. So I love that concept of practice spending a little bit. Don't come into retirement with this long bucket list of pent up activities that you haven't given yourself permission to pursue prior to retirement. Do it earlier if you can and your finances support it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It has some balance, right? Because that's what it really comes down to is, I want to do well and save and have a good retirement, but I'm also trying to do some living along the way because you don't know what the health situation is going to be in the future. You don't know what's going to happen with the markets. Maybe we have, 3 years of down markets, which we've only had a few times in history, and that's not the right time to retire. You got to draw back a little bit. So at least if you're in a situation to be able to enjoy it, but you're right, Christine. It's a hard psychology. I'm thinking of a client right now. If I say this, he's going to know I'm talking about him, but he's also a dear friend. So, I mean, they've got, 8-figure money and they spend $100,000 a year. And I'm like, guys, where's this money going to go? And they're like, we're going to leave it to our family. I'm like, well, you don't even like your family. So what are we doing? Right. But it is kind of funny to, people become in that savers mentality that's what they are and they identify with that. So let me ask you this. We at Allied Wealth, we have a system and it's called the Summit System. And the reason why we call it the Summit System is we believe that, saving enough money to retire, right, is almost like climbing Mount Everest, right? So we have proverbial Mount Everest in life, right? My dad's was triathlons. He became a championship triathlete. And so, a lot of us just saving enough money to get to retirement is kind of an Everest, right? So we have a saying that, what you did going up Mount Everest, the way you saved and accumulated money to get you to the top of the mountain, which represents the ability to retire on your terms, may not be the same thing you should do coming down the mountain to get to the Valley of the Promised Land, which is, go and meet your maker with some money in the bank and take care of your loved ones when you pass, right? What is your take on that? Should we do things differently before retirement and do things differently once we retire with our money?
Well, I have come to be a big believer in retirement, not as a hard stop, but ideally it's kind of a glide path that I think you would, sort of gradually move into. And that's what I've been trying to do actually with my own career a little bit, that I'm trying to make my work life more of what I want to do, trying to do less of the things I don't enjoy so much. Because for me, I've actually realized there's a lot about my work that gives me purpose, gives me connections, and that I want to keep doing at least in some fashion longer, maybe not 40 hours a week in perpetuity, but I do want to keep some aspects of it. So I would love people, once they pass the, say, age 50 mark, to start thinking about, what are aspects of your job that you could potentially do longer? And maybe the answer is, I don't like any of this. I just want an out. And I know that's the case for some people, but for a lot of us, there is something, maybe it's not even in the job itself, but there's some aspect of the work that is still valuable. Try to see if you can't find a way, maybe not necessarily doing it in a paid capacity, but try to keep that alive for yourself in some fashion as you move into your 60s and beyond. I think that's a really healthy model. When we look at the data, we see that wealthier people tend to be the ones who are working longer, and they need to work less, but they are healthier and they're able to work longer. I would like to see the spoils of that get a little bit more evenly distributed across our culture. But I think a glide path is just a better way to visualize moving into retirement than is sort of like, okay, one day I'm working 40 hours a week, and then the next day I'm, fully retired and sleeping in until 10:30.
And I totally agree with you. Kind of trail into it, and it's really interesting. In Texas, we work with a lot of people in the oil industry, and oftentimes they retire for a year and they get hired back as a consultant and work 6 months a year, and sometimes make more money than they were making when they were full-time employees. So it is really interesting. And I do see a lot of my clients that are doing that actually live a much more fulfilling, happy life. The money worries aren't there because they're earning a living still. The time that they, going to travel, that sort of thing, or they have that ability as well. One of my good clients, another example, the guy's now 75. And I said, are you ever going to retire? He says, with what I've got going on, there's no reason for me to. I work 6 months a year. I make $250,000 a year. Why would I retire? I said, hey, bud, I don't think I would either. That's a great gig. Do that as long as you can. And of course, his wife's in the background, who's 10 years younger than him, going, yeah, keep working. It's awesome. Right. So it's good. Yeah. I think it's especially important if you have a younger spouse,
Yes.
which I do, by the way. Well, tell me this. Let's shift into. I know the emotional side is just such an important thing, and I agree with you on that, because here's just quickly an example. And my dad's a United Airlines pilot. He flew 737s for United. He is forced to retire at age 65. It's not optional, right? So they're airline pilots are that situation where at 65 you got to pull the plug and go. And, it's gotta be, he hasn't it has not hit him yet, but at some point in time, it's going to be like, wait a minute. I used to fly 737s. That's pretty darn cool. I don't do that anymore. There's going to be a little bit of settling in, so to speak, with my dad. It'll be interesting to see how it unfolds, but nonetheless. So let's talk about investments for a minute. Like what you did to save and accumulate enough money for retirement. Okay. And then you move into, I've got this bucket of money, this portfolio of money. And basically, what do I do with my 401k, my pension, my Roth IRA, my 403b, my K plan or A plan or B plan, right? What do I do with those to allow me to go out into the world and spend money with confidence, even though the stock markets may be down, rates may be up or down, political fears, geopolitical risks like wars and that sort of thing. I mean, what are some ideas that you have around allocating capital to get people, to a 20, 30 year, 40-year timeline coverage?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, I would say I like people to back up a couple steps before they get to the investment portfolio. So I think the first thing, even if you haven't been a budgeting household in the years leading up to retirement, it's time to start tracking your spending and just trying to get your arms around what you're spending today. And, maybe you can back into it with credit card statements or something like that. But I really like people taking the time. It's not fun, but taking the time to do kind of a granular budget for my house where I'm figuring out what are my discretionary outlays? What are my fixed outlays? So I'd start there, like get my arms around what those are. And then the next step, I think, is to try to look at that fixed line of expenses, or it'll be a series of lines, where you're totaling those up, your housing costs, your taxes, whatever healthcare will be in retirement. And that may be a little bit different than when you were working, but the expenditures you have to make no matter what. Look at those. And then you mentioned earlier, Ryan, guaranteed income, non-portfolio income. That's where I would love to see people try to line that up. So can they get the Social Security? Plus, if there's a shortfall, maybe some type of a very basic annuity to line up with whatever those fixed outlays are. And then to me, everything with the portfolio and the plan gets easier if I know that those fixed expenses are addressed through those non-portfolio income sources. And then I'm constructing the portfolio to supply my discretionary expenses. And, sort of the rule of thumb I like to use is to think about maybe 10 years worth of portfolio withdrawals, earmarking that for safer types of assets, like maybe a little bit of cash, maybe fixed income assets. And then to my mind, the remainder of the portfolio can go into assets with higher growth potential, probably some sort of a globally diversified stock portfolio. So I would kind of see it as a 3-step process where you're doing that budgeting, you're looking at your non-portfolio income sources, and then after that, you're allocating the portfolio to support whatever discretionary spending that you might expect to have. And the nice thing about having the portfolio address the discretionary spending is that you're inherently going to be a little bit more flexible with those expenditures. And that is a really beneficial thing, because when we look at all of the research that's been done on retirement spending over the years, it's that if you can be flexible, if you can pull in your withdrawals a little bit in that sustained down market and perhaps spend a little bit less in a really good market environment like the current one, that is just a great thing to do in terms of your portfolio's ability to last over whatever your time horizon is.
Yeah, we call that a dynamic spending plan, right?
Exactly.
If the market's doing really good, maybe take a little bit more out, add some more to your cash bucket that year if you don't spend that money, right? And if the market's not doing great, maybe go to that cash reserve bucket. It's really interesting too. I follow Dr. Wade Pfau quite a bit. I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Pfau. He's got his RISA program, the Retirement Income Personality Awareness or Style Awareness. And I broke it down to a little bit further than that. I just said, hey, let's have a risk on style, meaning I'm okay having my income for retirement coming from risk-based assets, such as fixed income, stocks, international, whatever the equity positions may be. And, I've got enough assets to where if the market were to decline 20, 30%, I'm still going to be okay. And there's plenty of people out there that can do that. But then you have what I call the risk off folks, right? And some of the people out there, they don't want to depend upon the markets, whether it be bond or equity, or fixed income or equity, to dictate the quality of lifestyle they live in their golden years. And so they kind of glean more towards the safer investments, like a 30-year treasury bond could be an idea to fund your retirement, right? Because for 30 years, you get those interest payments. And if you retire at 60, 30 years out, you're 90, right?
Right.
So
Or a TIPS bond portfolio maybe is more what I would gravitate to, where you're getting that inflation protection embedded.
Let's spend a minute on that, all right? Because I hear a lot of experts talking about tips. And I one of the things I really like to do on the channel here is you and I can talk about formulas and Monte Carlo simulations and standard deviations and alpha and beta, probably till we're blue in the face. But our average listener doesn't really understand what that stuff is, right? What is a tip? Like, what does it do? How does it work? How can I use it to my benefit in my golden years?
Right. So these are securities. They're like treasury bonds. So they're guaranteed by the US government, but they have another nice aspect to them that treasury bonds don't, which is that the principal value of your TIPS bond adjusts a little bit to help keep you whole with respect to inflation. So you get a little bit of an interest payment, but you also get that inflation adjustment on top of it. So that's why academic types often say TIPS are kind of the safest bond around, because they have AAA credit quality backed by the US government which is as good as it gets. And then they have that bit of inflation protection to protect your purchasing power. So I think that they are a nice bulwark against inflation. If there's kind of a counterpoint, it's that they're a little bit inflexible. So if you build a TIPS ladder to match each year of your anticipated expenses, it's kind of hard to undo that once you've set it up. That's probably the main drawback. And happily, we're seeing some innovation in the investment product space, where I expect very much in the next couple of years, we'll see some neat products come online to help address that pain point of the inflexibility that you get with building a ladder of individual TIPS bonds.
Yeah, I agree with you too. A lot of the annuities out there, as complex as they can be, they're adding inflation riders now. A lot more of them are. And that can be helpful because you get a stated rate of growth each year. You get less up in the front years. So you could also use an annuity ladder. But, one of the things that we have to do as advisors for our client base is we have to decode the complicated formulas that insurance companies use to arrive at the amount of income they pay out for every dollar you invest. And it can be very complicated. But it can be simple. It's, listen, this company's got this rider with this roll-up rate and this income account value bonus and all these different things. But the only thing that matters is for your unique situation, for every dollar you invest, how much income do you receive? And can it be inflation adjusted if that's your concern?
I was going to say one knock on annuities, even though in general, I think that they can be pretty effective products, is just that I don't believe currently you can buy one that is linked to what the consumer price index is. You can buy kind of a fixed inflation rider, right?
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of the TIPS bond, is that whatever inflation is, if we have another repeat of 2021, 2022, where we had, very high, like 8% inflation for a year there, your TIPS bond is going to come through for you and help preserve your purchasing power. The inflation rider on the annuity, I think, is just kind of a fixed percentage. So that's a potential drawback.
Yeah, it certainly is. Most of them are 2, 3, it's some fixed percentage. And so, it's kind of interesting too, we have to navigate these tools, right? It's like when you go out to the toolbox, you might have the job of hanging a picture, and you might use a screw gun, a level, and a tape measure, right? But in that moment, you're going to bypass the wrenches and the crescent wrench and the socket set, Doesn't mean those are bad tools. It just means that in that moment, those aren't the right tools for the job. But the point too is there's really no perfect tool set out there.
That's right. I would say the closest, and we've kind of danced around this, is Social Security in terms of being a guaranteed income source that is pure inflation protection. So in that 2021, 2022 period, you are going to get whatever the CPI was reflected in your paycheck increase, which is why people need to make smart decisions about Social Security filing, because it's one of the most important assets that anyone will have in retirement.
Yeah, we had Mary Beth Franklin on recently.
She's awesome.
Social Security. She's an amazing human being, just vibrant as can be and awesome. But she really was a big advocate. And I like this. And I'll get your take on this too. When people are looking at their Social Security benefits, don't look at the number that's on that statement. Look at what you keep in your bank account after taxes and multiply that times the number of months in a year times your life expectancy, right? And look at it as a total asset. And once you start to see those numbers, you begin to take a little bit more care about your Social Security decisions, because I've got this one client, I talk about him often. He is adamant that Social Security won't be there for him in the future. So he's 62 and I'm going to get mine now. And I'm going to get as much as I can out of the system. The challenge of that, Christine, is his wife's 10 years younger than him. And I'm like, you're going to leave her with a much smaller Social Security check that you could have if you'd have waited until 70. And then if you go look at the national average Social Security check, I think we're around just over $1,600 a month. Yet, 67 benefits right now are around $3,000. If you go out to 70, it's like $4,000. I mean, what are we missing here? What's happening in your mind?
Well, I think part of it is that we've had a really strong market. And that's something I encounter a lot, is the people who say, I'm fearful about Social Security either going away or, them doing means testing or something like that will curtail my eventual benefits. So there's that. And then simultaneously, we've had this really strong equity market. And this is the profile that I seem to run into a lot in my work, is the person who thinks, I can out invest whatever increase you're telling me I get for delaying Social Security, that I can out earn that by investing in the market. And that always makes my head spin, because, you're comparing apples to oranges there, because one of those things is guaranteed, and that's the increase you get in Social Security for every year that you're able to delay past your full retirement age. Whereas whatever you've been earning in the market, even though it's been really strong over the past decade, it is not guaranteed by any stretch. So I always get a little dejected when I'm talking to people about the value of delaying, because I feel like we're not really hearing each other. But there's a lot of confusion and worry around Social Security today. And I can see why Social Security is underfunded relative to what it needs to be, that Congress does need to take action to shore it up. But I think for people who are, say, and never say never, but if you're in your mid 50s or beyond, it's a pretty good bet that whatever your promised benefits are will be there, because older adults vote at a very high rate. It's one of the most prized benefits that government delivers to us. I would really struggle to see Congress making wholesale changes to dismantle that for near-term retirees. For younger people who are, say, under 40, I think it's reasonable to assume there will be some incremental changes. We don't know exactly what they will be. It may be lifting the cap on the amount of income that's currently subject to Social Security tax. Maybe it's more tinkering with the ages at which you're eligible to take Social Security. Maybe it is means testing. But if I'm a higher income, younger person, I would probably haircut my promised benefits a little bit in my planning calculations just to be safe. I don't know, Ryan, how you deal with younger clients who are kind of grappling with how much weight to put on Social Security if you do haircut their benefits, or how you approach that. I'd be curious.
Well, that's a great question, because what we've looked at, and Mary Beth Franklin and I also talked this on the show as well, is if you look at the numbers, about 78 cents on the dollar of Social Security benefits are going to be stable, maintainable in the future, right? Even though the trust fund is empty. So, if what you should do is plan currently, even with existing clients that are on Social Security. If you're worried about it, if it's a concern of yours, we can address it by buying some type of an annuity, a deferred income annuity. This is, okay, listen, if your Social Security is X, let's grow it for the CPI over the, 10, 15 years. And in the event that haircut comes, we take this deferred income annuity and we activate it. So we call it the kind of a Social Security deduction insurance benefit. It's not exactly what it is, but it's kind of like that. And then the person can activate that income and then they use it, right? And if they don't use it, there's a death benefit, or they can use the money in other ways and that sort of thing. That's one way to handle it. But convincing the younger generation, it's tough. They're more skeptical in a lot of ways. They're concerned about the national debt being $37 trillion. It's concerned about what's going to happen in the future. We've got all this tariff stuff coming into place, and there's good press and bad press on the tariffs. So it's a little bit more difficult to help them navigate that. But I do try to have the same conversation and say, listen, I do believe your age to claim benefits won't be 62. Maybe it's 70. Maybe it's 72. Then we go into our 70s. 72 is early age. 76 is FRA, in the future. And then age 80 is late claiming benefits. I don't know the answer. But a good advisor will help someone navigate that concern by saying, listen, if you save this much money and you invest early and save early, you don't even have to worry about Social Security in a lot of cases. So
there was a planner I knew in the Chicago area who told me he would always sit down with younger clients and he'd always get this feedback, like don't include Social Security because we're worried about it. And so he said he would run the plan that way. And then they'd be like, oh, maybe put it back in, because they would see the kind of the heroic implications for their savings rates if they totally excluded Social Security. So that always made me smile when he shared that anecdote.
It is helpful. And like I said, I'm not a doom and gloom kind of guy. I believe in this country and I believe in our system, and I believe that we will get it right. It may not happen as fast as we want it to. It's not going to be perfect. It's, we're going to probably, some of us will take a haircut, the younger generation, which is fine. I'm going to live longer in retirement. According to statistics, I've got a little bit longer timeline to save and prepare for retirement, which is interesting. So I appreciate your take on that too. And I think one thing that people forget about Social Security is it's very tax efficient. Only 85% of it's taxable, right? And that's an important aspect. What is your take on taxation in retirement? Do you think you will pay more in taxes, or do you think you'll spend more on healthcare?
Oh, it's a good question. I haven't looked at that specific question before, Ryan. I would guess it depends on the retiree's own situation. Certainly for more affluent older adults, the tax bills are a bit of a shocker in retirement, especially if they are kind of the baby boomer generation that took full advantage of the tax deferred retirement savings vehicles. So the traditional 401ks and IRAs, those are the folks who sometimes in retirement, is certainly once they hit their required minimum distribution age, which is now 73, that's the group that oftentimes is sort of taking a big gulp when they see the direct tax implications of those RMDs, as well as some of the knock-on tax effects, like the Medicare surtax, the IRMA that can kick in, which is one reason I always tell people this is an area where it really helps to get some financial planning guidance or get some tax guidance from someone who is well-versed in the ins and outs of your various account types, because there are some strategies you can use pre-required minimum distribution, specifically considering some Roth conversions, considering maybe even preemptively accelerating your traditional IRA withdrawals in those pre-RMD years. There's a group of strategies, and I'm sure you work with your clients on this all the time, that you can use post-retirement pre-RMD to help lower those future tax bills. And it's not a back of the envelope type of calculation. You really want to sit down with someone who has some high powered software who can do the projections for you and help figure out how much you can convert in each of the next couple of years after retirement in order to help lower your tax bills later on.
Yeah, and we spend a lot of time talking about the tax time bomb, which is in
Right.
essence what it is, and a lot of folks, we also look at the composition of their accounts, right? Because, how much you have in your 401k IRA, how much in Roth, how much in after-tax brokerage type accounts and bank money, that sort of thing. But, the old way of financial planning, I think it's a little outdated due to the tax situation today. We used to be taught that you spend your after-tax money first, then you go to your IRA dollars, and then you go to your Roth IRA dollars. And I don't think that that's really the right way to do things this at this point in time, right? We're suggesting people leave their after-tax money alone. In fact, I just had the same conversation with my dad who just retired. He was going to spend after-tax money first. I said, Dad, don't do that. Go here to the IRA and start taking money out of these IRAs so that when you do get to, in his case, will be, I believe, 75 for RMD. When you get to the RMD age, the IRA balances may be the same or lower, but your after-tax money will be much bigger, and you can actually use that as a filter, or as a filler, so to speak, because now we're in a situation with the new Big Beautiful Bill Act. A married couple could have nearly $144,000 in income and still be in the 12% tax bracket. That's pretty darn good.
Mm-hmm. Definitely the after-tax dollars, the taxable accounts, have a lot more flexibility, obviously, than is the case with those traditional IRAs that, no one's telling you you've got to take your money out on a preset schedule. A lot of the funds in those accounts will probably qualify for the low long-term capital gains rate that's currently in place today. So I think you're exactly right that kind of mowing down that account before you even begin thinking about pulling from the tax deferred account is not the right strategy, because those taxable accounts will give you flexibility as you move into retirement and will give you just a little more wiggle room around your tax liabilities in each year.
So let's talk about what I call it probably the most hidden and largest penal thing in the tax code, and it's the widow's tax. All right. So what are some things that can be done tax planning wise for someone who maybe retired with the majority of their assets in a 401k from work? All right. And the husband's a little bit older than the wife. Okay. And we know that what's going to happen here in the country in the next, really starting now for the next 20 years, is the women are going to outlive the males, and the males are going to die off, and the women will be in control of the wealth in this country. But something happens when one spouse dies in the household, what's called the widow's tax. We could talk about that for a few minutes and spend some time on that, how to plan for that and what we could do about it?
Well, I will say I'm not an expert in this area. In fact, that was one piece of feedback I received on the book. I received a really poignant email from a woman who said that she lost her husband, I think at quite an early age, and said that she really wished that there had been a chapter in the book on widowhood, because obviously she had suffered a deep personal loss, and losing a spouse that, there's almost no greater loss in life. And there had also been direct financial implications for her as well. So there's typically the loss of some portion of Social Security income will go away once you lose your spouse. If your spouse had a pension that didn't have a survivor benefit, or that, curtailed the pension payments upon his or her death, that will also result in a cut in the paycheck. So those are a couple of the big things. It seems like you're thinking about something from an investment standpoint, and I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, and we can write the chapter together right now, because the thing that scares me and that's overlooked often when it comes to the Roth conversion strategies that we've been talking about and how to spend the IRA dollars down first is when one spouse dies, the surviving spouse has 1 year left to file a joint tax return, at which time the surviving spouse moves over into the single filer brackets. Okay.
Right.
Now, we just talked about you could have about 144,000 a year in income as a married couple filing jointly over 65 in the U.S. today and still be in the 12% tax bracket, right? But when you go to the single filer brackets, that amount drops down to $72,000 a year. All right. So the surviving spouse, likely the woman, okay, has lost a Social Security check. She's going to pay more tax on the remaining income than she did when the husband was in the house. And then the other thing we find out is that, widows don't just go home and sit there and pout. They actually kind of go out and live, right? They don't want to cook dinner because it doesn't make sense to cook for one person. They'll go out more. They vacation more. They often spend more money, and they go travel more, right? So I think it's really important for people that have this information that we just talked about here to plan accordingly, because the widow's tax is a real thing, and it's a real threat to women out there in a big way. We're huge advocates of education on that.
Yeah, no, that sounds like such a valuable service to help your clients get ahead of those changes. It seems like you would probably want to do that work with both partners, right? Where you're preemptively thinking about what the implications would be. But you're right that women on average outlive their spouses by a couple of years. So it's probably well worth putting the emphasis more on the female partner in the couple.
And we usually do that for that reason, Christine. It's kind of funny. We have sometimes the engineers will come in the office and they'll slide us a spreadsheet, and I'll take the spreadsheet and turn it back over and slide it right back to them and says, "Your spouse coming in today?" Well, no, they're not. I'm like, "Well, sir, the most important person in this room right now is your spouse, and we need to get her here to talk about financial planning."
I love that.
It's true. It's so true. It really is true. So let's shift gears and let's go to an area that I know for a fact you're an expert on. And this is real. And it's scary. And when I started in the industry, there was a 1 in 2 chance that you would ever need it. Okay. But now it's starting to look closer to like a 70% chance that you're going to need this. And it's the necessity to cover long-term care expenses at some point in time in your life and in retirement. I know you've got a lot of stuff to say on this. I'd love to hear, how do we help people navigate? Do I self-insure? Do I buy long-term care insurance? Do I buy some annuities with income riders that have long-term features built in? Do I use a life insurance policy? I mean, there's so many different ways of doing it, but what's the best way for people to navigate these waters? Yeah,
I've become obsessed with this problem because when I go out and speak to groups of older adults, I find it's kind of the elephant in the room in terms of their financial plans. Even people with a lot of financial wherewithal have angst about having an effective balloon payment at the end of their lives where, they might have $100,000 or more in outlays. And if you're part of a married couple, you can double that for whatever number of years you might be covered by long-term care. And the average usage is something like 1.5 to 2 years per person. So the numbers get very large very quickly. I think the key kind of clarifying point is to figure out which of the 3 major buckets your situation falls into. So for people who have very little in terms of portfolio wealth, who are mainly reliant on Social Security, well, they will probably be reliant on government resources if they end up needing long-term care. And in a way, they probably have to worry a little bit less than the people with assets because there's not a lot of planning you can do. If you're, just sort of barely able to meet your living expenses in retirement, you can't be worried with long-term care expenses. Maybe your home can come into play at the end of your life where either you get a reverse mortgage or you sell that home to help unlock some of the proceeds from that home. But that's kind of one category. And then the other extreme, Ryan, is the one you referenced, would be the person with more wealth, with a portfolio that easily can meet the living expenses in retirement and maybe has some overage where you could set aside a long-term care fund to help meet those costs if they occur. And so, maybe a ballpark estimate would be to, for a married couple, set aside, say, 4 years worth of long-term care expenses and some very long-term bucket with a lot of growth potential if you're just sort of embarking on retirement, because the data would suggest that if you're 65, you probably won't need long-term care until you're like in your early 80s or even mid 80s or later. So that's the other extreme, the person with a lot of wealth. And then for the bulk of the people who fall between those two extremes, then some type of an insurance product would be appropriate, whether it's pure long-term care insurance, which has gotten pretty unpopular due to very high premium increases, or increasingly we've seen these hybrid type products, either a life insurance policy with a long-term care rider or an annuity with a long-term care rider, where if it turns out that you need long-term care, you can tap that benefit and it will reduce either the annuity payments or the amount of life insurance accordingly. So I think kind of self-segregating, doing a little bit of analysis on your situation or working with a planner to help analyze where you fall, and also keeping in mind peace of mind considerations that I know many older adults who easily fall into that third bucket where they have or I guess it was my second bucket, the person who has more than enough to fund their living expenses, but it's still kind of this nagging worry of, having to invade that portfolio to pay for long-term care. In those situations, some type of an insurance product may make sense. And I find that personal experience informs our attitude toward peace of mind, that those of us who have had some kind of a long-term care crisis with our parents or grandparents are the ones who are most determined to lock down this risk prior to retirement, that we want to kind of button it up and not have it something that we're worried about.
Yeah, one of the strategies that we use is, and oftentimes people will come to us and that the home is paid for, right? And, we say, listen, the home is out there, it's paid for. That's growing at, usually a 2.5-3% rate of growth over time. So we kind of run those numbers out in the future. And sometimes you could use the home as a way to get coverage for long-term care, do some type of reverse mortgage. And there's a new plan out there too. I'm looking into it, but there's like a line of credit you can get out of the house as well while you still live in it. There's a lot of opportunities out there. That's one of the few places I would consider a reverse mortgage. But I think a lot of times people overlook that asset, the value of it in the future, and its potential to be a hedge against the need to cover long-term care expenses.
Very much so. It's very inefficient that people exhaust their liquid resources and don't look to that home equity at all. And sometimes, might really have a lot of angst around their spending and how much they have less, and how much they have left, and hiding in plain sight is this home equity that I think for people with tighter financial plans, it absolutely should be part of the toolkit.
I agree. And I wasn't being rude on my phone. I was actually on my financial calculator doing some equations. And I said the average cost of care in the state of Texas right now is $85,000. Now we work all over the country, but it's $85,000 a year. Okay. Well, we grow the cost of long-term care not by 3% at the office, but by 5%. Okay. And in some cases, I think it should be more than that. But if I run $85,000 a year in cost of long-term care out at a 5% growth rate, assuming somebody retiring at 65, 25 years, it's $287,000 a year, right? And you said
for
that's
1 year.
The average for 1 year. That's exactly right. So if somebody's in there for 2 years, that's $575,000. And God forbid both the husband and wife need it, mom and dad need it. That's $1 million.
Right.
It really is. It's a real threat to a nest egg. There's ways to plan around it, but people should be aware of it and don't just put our heads in the sand.
Well, absolutely. And I think people need to understand the relationship between health and cognitive decline, because healthy body, mind that is failing is a very common profile among people who are, in their 90s and beyond. And that's the specific confluence of events that you need to be the most worried about would be that extended run, needing long-term care, needing help with your activities of daily living because your body's okay, but your mind is failing. And so I would say for wealthier people who have had good health, they're the ones who need to be especially cautious and make sure they have a plan. And I realize it's a very depressing topic, but nonetheless, one that's important to think of in advance.
Yeah, I totally agree, Christine. And I'm a big fan in the right situation of having the kids get involved. And the more educated, the more successful the kids are, I'm more about getting them involved because I have another client that I'll reference. And he's a brother and two brothers and a sister. All right. Well, he had done really well. And the brother and sister knew he had done well. And mom was in a facility, like you said, very healthy. She was actually, the mom was actually a runner. Okay. But had cognitive decline. She was in a facility for 9 years. And my client, because the other two wouldn't pay, had to pay for the cost of care for nearly 7 years. And now Christmases are awkward, and holidays are awkward and the family's kind of broken up over it and that sort of thing. So it really is important to have, a plan for long-term care coverage, have a caretaker, whatever it is, have a plan in place. And I think it is as important as Social Security claiming strategy or picking investments to roll your 401k into to generate retirement income. I think it's up there with the level of importance of that.
Absolutely. And your point about family discussions is such an important one where, there are sad stories like the one you just referenced, but I can't tell you how many times I've heard of stories where the children get brought in and the children's answer is, Mom and Dad, it's your money. I want you to take care of yourself. Forget about us. We're fine. You launched us. You paid for college. Please spend what you need to spend on yourselves and don't be so worried about inheritances. Because I think in a lot of families, that might be exactly the feedback they would get from their financially well children, that the children want mom and dad to use everything that they have and not be so worried about leaving a bequest. Sometimes there's that disconnect, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think there's a strong desire in the baby boomer generation to leave some money behind. And I think sometimes they do that at the sacrifice of their well-being of health, emotion, and also enjoying life in their golden years.
Right. And, sometimes it's mom is completely exhausting herself to take care of dad. And we've all seen stories where, well, what happens when mom goes first? Because that can happen where, mom is the one who is working so hard to take care of dad and dad's still living and mom has some health issue and passes away very quickly. That seems to happen all the time.
Well, and oftentimes the stress of the caregiver
exactly
it causes faster health decline in that person, and they're wind up dying, as you said before, the person who's actually under the duress of needing the long-term care. It's fascinating stuff. It really is. And then you've got I think Rick Edelman talks about this about aging, and then there's the MIT University study on the whole department they have on aging, and they're talking in some cases, Christine, that the kids will be 90, mom and dad will be like 110, and the grandparents will be like 125 or something like, some crazy numbers like this in the future, all living together in the same house because they're all out of money. It's just, it's mind boggling, these things. So, there just seems to be an adage that if you plan for things, you're prepared for them. And oftentimes if you plan for things, those things don't happen. Right. And I think planning for long-term care is that important. Well, Christine, I have really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, me too. Thank you.
Before we go, thinking about people out there who are retirement minded, what's something that you want them to take away from your book and from your work? That's just amazing category or a catalog of work, if you will. What's something that you want folks to take away?
One through line in the book, as I read through the chapters, and I read them each about 20 times in getting the book ready, but everybody talks about the value of relationships, that there's been a lot of research done on human health and wellness and well-being. And much of it comes down to who you love, who loves you. And so I think that's a key piece of advice I would have in the realm of retirement. You've got to nurture your relationships. Ideally, you diversify that relationship network a little bit, where you've got people of different ages who you love in your life, and people certainly with children or grandchildren. That's kind of a naturally diversified network of people who you love and love spending time with. But to try to be preemptive as you move into retirement, because many retirees are isolated and lonely in retirement. So you've got to make a plan to find those social connections. I am always thrilled to see when I have a day off, I would go to my gym and I'll see that is like the nexus of social activity among older adults in my community. I see so much going on there every morning, people having coffee, playing pickleball, in the gym on the equipment, talking. What a great bringing together of social activity, physical activity. Just those social connections are everything. And the good news is it has nothing to do with money. It's easy to cultivate social, not easy, but it's certainly not reliant on your finances. So men especially tend to struggle a little bit with relationships once they move out of the workplace, that oftentimes their social connections did come through work. And of course, that's a huge generalization, but men need to be especially mindful about where they will go for social connections once they separate from work.
Well, that's an awful lot of wisdom from the Director of Personal Finance at Morningstar, Christine Benz. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's been my pleasure.
Subscribe to Redefine Retirement on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.